thank you for joining us, everybody. We're super happy to talk about this delicate topic together. I'm still waiting on Kat to join us, but I'm just gonna tell you that this is as an introduction, this is gonna be an hour-long session. So the first 30 minutes or so is gonna be a discussion between the panelists, and then we'll open it to the audience for questions. For that, we're gonna check in the chat and for the questions, but please be sure to hold all of your questions until the time that we're saying, hey, we're opening up for questions, because otherwise it's gonna be hard for me to scroll back up to find your questions, and then we won't be able to answer them. So please hold all your questions until that. And anytime throughout the session, if you want to enlarge a person or an image, you need to double click on that image. All right, so that being said, my name is Celia Hodent, and we're gonna talk about ethics in the game industry and how we can improve ethics at large, and it's a very delicate topic, like I said. So I'm gonna start with a round of introductions very quickly, and then we're gonna dive deeper into the topic, and we're also gonna talk about this initiative that we have to start a code of ethics, collaborative effort, and so we're going to talk about all that. But first, so I'm going to introduce myself. So my name is Celia Hodent, and I have a PhD in psychology, and I've been working in the video game industry for over 12 years now. So I worked at Ubisoft, at LucasArts, and at Epic Games. And ever since late 2017, I've been working independently as a game UX consultant, so working on user experience. And I've been quite interested about questions around ethics and inclusion, because this is part of user experience. We need to offer the best experience possible to our players, and this includes being ethical and being inclusive and accessible. So this is the reason why I've been thinking about all of this topic. So now I'm going to introduce everybody on the panel. We'll let them introduce themselves. I don't know if you see the same order on my screen as I see it. So I'm going to pretend we all see on the same order. So I'm going to start by Carlos, since you're the second one on my screen. Hi, Carlos.
Hi there. Well, thank you. My name is Carlos Figueiredo. I'm Director of Community Trust and Safety for Two Hat, where we protect online games from abuse and harassment. I'm also a co-founder of the Fair Play Alliance and a vice chair of that organization. And prior to that, I started my journey working for Disney Online Studios for the now defunct Club Penguin. So that's how I got into online games. For 6 years, taking care of content moderation and also chat filtering there for them. So that's how I got involved with this world. And also, I studied a little bit of philosophy in Brazil, so I think ethics have a thing or two related to philosophy. And when it comes to my motivation for really being here and talking to those lovely ladies, it's really related to what I believe we need to be more intentional about. And it's being intentional about the experiences and games that we create so that they are more inclusive, they're more diverse, they are safer, and they are just fulfilling the promise to be a place where everybody can have fun together.
So do you want to introduce the Fair Play Alliance very quickly and talk about what?
For sure, yes. So the Fair Play Alliance is a cohort of game developers. It's a professional group that started as a grassroots movement, if you will, back in 2017. And what started very small, now we are over 160 game developers globally. And we are really looking at how we can design games with having in mind a very productive and positive experience for players. So from the very design of those products and experiences, we are trying to change culture and change this space.
Kate, do you would like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kate Edwards. I'm the current executive director of the Global Game Jam organization. I'm the former executive director of the International Game Developers Association. I have been in the game industry for over 27 years. Working as a geographer, which is my background. My degrees are in geography and cartography and other stuff. And I do culturalization work in the game industry and beyond, basically helping developers avoid political and cultural issues that get them into a lot of trouble. And actually, that is the foundation upon which my interest in ethics has been around and dovetailing with the game industry for many, many years, because a lot of the decisions that I'm helping guide companies through really come down to the company's values and their value system and their ethics. Like, do they represent a certain cultural group in a certain way to serve the narrative or to serve the local expectation? Do they represent a certain country or region, like Taiwan, if they show it independent, that will damage their business in China, and are they willing to take that step? There's a lot of different kinds of decisions around that. The other part of it too is in my later years in the industry, working more on the advocacy side, the way seeing game workers are treated, the issues around diversity and inclusion. There's just a whole host of issues for which our industry needs to do far better. And I think that certainly has increased my interest in the topic.
Kat?
Hey, I'm Kat Lowe. I'm a researcher, often UX, and right now I'm a content moderation lead at Meedan, which is a nonprofit, for fact checking and stuff like that. And then I also do consulting with social media platforms and some pop culture related, forums and websites. I got my start moderating communities, specifically, Reddit communities, Facebook, Discord. Specifically, actually, women in games communities, because I needed them at the time. Then I started studying moderation around 10 years ago, started doing harassment crisis support, particularly for women who play games. And so these days, I now have gone to the content moderation side where I'm like, I want to change the system from the inside. So I'm thinking about not just sort of the mediation part and social interaction part of community moderation, but how do you then scale up to millions of players even? And how do you do that while still enabling active social experiences and play and a sense of freedom while, not enabling people to harass each other?
Yep. Okay, so the discussion, we're gonna have it around two main angles. The first angle is why do we care about ethics from the player's side? We are we create content, and so we need to understand a little bit what's the impact of this content on players. The second part is going to be more about the need to think about ethics from the game industry side for workers. We've been talking a lot about these topics the past weeks. It's been quite difficult for a lot of people. So it's also a topic that we need to address. Like I said, it's very broad and difficult to talk about all of that, and very delicate. So the idea is more to start a discussion. A lot of people have been discussing about that, but try to really have a bigger movement so we can try to address these things and understand what it means and what we should do. So the first part is the ethics. Why do we need to think about ethics from the player's perspective? So this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, coming from psychology, because I know that any environment is going to influence us in a way or another. So sometimes the influence is quite neutral. I often take the example of a handle that you have on a door. That's going to influence you to grab that handle and pull the door. It's not a bad influence. It's bad when the doors actually needs to be pushed because then it's annoying. But other than that, it doesn't impact you in a negative way. But the influence can sometimes be more negative and sometimes be positive. This is the reason why we have Games for Change, so we can look at how an environment like a game can have a positive impact on people. And so we need to understand how this works, and it's quite difficult because we don't understand everything in a psychological point of view. But because there is that impact, we have the responsibility to think about that impact, and if sometimes there's a negative impact, how can we identify it and how we can correct it so our players have the best experience possible. Like I said, user experience is all about that, is always putting the players at the center of what we do, thinking about players first. And so placing the players the priority is the benefit of the players even before the benefit of the business. Video games is also a business. We need to make money to survive. So that's fair, but we should never place the business before the benefit of players or their well-being. So what does that mean, and in what situations it's creating a problem? So I've been thinking about that, and the 4 elements that I looked into was the questions around addiction, because there's a lot of claims around addiction. So I'm not going to enter into that topic because it's quite delicate, and the specialists actually don't agree if we should call it addiction or not. They don't even agree on the definition of addiction. So it's quite complicated. But what I'm interested in is more around the questions of the attention economy. Is our video games sometimes, can they encourage players to play longer play times when they actually did not want to play that long? And do we have a responsibility to not do that? So it's more around all of these questions, like in other sectors, like in technology at large. We talk about infinite scrolling or autoplay videos, like you came over to watch one video on the platform, and now you've been watching like 10 videos back to back because you had that autoplay, and so it's encouraging you to keep watching. So the question is where is the line? Should we not encourage players to play too long? And when is this a problem? And then the questions also around gambling and loot boxes. So that's been quite, there was a lot of questions around that. Are gambling loot boxes, and in which conditions? So gambling and loot boxes, it's all about variable rewards. So it's when you're opening a box, a loot, and you don't know what you're going to get. But loot boxes typically are usually tied to monetization. And so this is when it starts to look more like gambling. It's just like in casino, you're going to pay money, to pull a lever, and maybe you're going to get something awesome, and maybe you're not going to get something awesome. So it's a little bit of the same principle with loot boxes. And to me, the problem is it's when it's tied to monetization. When you need money, you have a currency that either you're buying with real money or you get it through long play times, and you need that currency to open loot boxes. It's a bit different than any other variable rewards, because we know that variable rewards are more engaging. So I'm sure you've heard of the Skinner box and stuff like that. But now there's also a lot of people blaming variable rewards at large, but we have variable rewards everywhere. So any game that uses a draw of cards or using a throw of dice is using variable rewards. If you play Mario Kart, you have variable rewards when you have these bonuses, and you get something sometimes super cool or sometimes not that useful. It's not a problem, and it can be very engaging. A lot of games, again, are using that. It becomes more of an issue when we use that engaging element to encourage people to play longer times or to buy more. So it's all about these elements, like what exactly is the problem? Where is the mechanic that we need to look into so we can define an ethical line that we don't want to cross? It's not about saying like having like moral panics around games and ban everything without real understanding why. It's all about understanding what is a problem, why, and what we should do about it. The other elements were around violent content. When is it a problem? When is it not a problem? So I want to go fast because now I'm talking too much. And the last element was around dark patterns. So a dark pattern is a design that is purposely deceptive, and that is not in users' best interest, and it is to the business best interest. So it's when you have an interface and it's tricking you to subscribe to something that you didn't want to subscribe, but you didn't see it because it was already ticked and you didn't realize that was the case. So there's all these elements where you did not really realize that was going on, and when the design is influencing you to buy or play more. And it's all around these notions where It's more to the benefit of the company than it is of the benefit of the players. When we fall into dark pattern, we actually are betraying UX, the UX mindset, because the UX mindset is about placing the players above the business perspective. So we need to find good balance here. And sometimes dark patterns are used in tech. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look at the website darkpatterns.org. There's a lot of examples in that. And we should be aware of that. And we should try to see how this applies to video games and how to avoid them, so we can have great games that offer a great experience. We can make money, but everything is in equilibrium. So that's the starting point. To me, it's more like coming from UX and thinking about all these things and ensuring that we always think about the players first, and we offer great experience that is respectful to our players. So this is my perspective. So now I'm just going to do the same order. I'm going to ask Carlos to talk more about his perspective and what he cares about in ethics from the player's standpoint.
Thank you, Celia. So my perspective would come from the social interactions, the aspect of many video games that we see nowadays, right? They have an online component and social elements. And especially now, right, where there is a heavy reliance on online communities to fulfill those social needs. I think it has just put everything on overdrive in terms of that social responsibility, ethical responsibility in terms of social interactions. What was already very high earlier this year, starting in March, just became much more of a moral imperative from my point of view. Which is the first point that I want to cover, is the moral imperative to, if you're providing a service, an entertainment, an experience, you do have a moral imperative to ensure that folks are safeguarded in your game. And beyond that, also that you're providing something that's inclusive and also diverse, right? So that is the first thing. And I don't think there is much of a question to that part of the moral imperative. I think we see this in the climate right now. Companies are stepping up. Companies are actually taking very strong stances that I have never seen them take before. I'm sure I've had conversations about this in the past with Kate. And it brings me back to like 2 years ago when we were saying companies need to take a stronger stance, right? And the hands have been forced, right? For a lack of a better word there. But also, in terms of the second point that I really want to cover is ethics, I think from this point of view, matters a lot when the players are telling us that they want us to do a better job at this. And I'm going to cite two specific surveys that were conducted last year. One was the Anti-Defamation League survey, the free-to-play survey they did, right? And there are a lot of great insights there, and you can see that players do care about this, right? They do care about diversity, inclusion. They want to feel safe. They are often quitting games because of harassment. If I remember correctly, it's 19% of the players they surveyed were quitting games or reconsidering it because of harassment. We're talking about one in five, basically, right? The other example is EA Games survey, which I also believe came out early last year. And they analyzed what inclusion and diversity means for their players, right? And there are a lot of great answers there too. So the players are telling us, they're telling us that they care about this, majority of players. And I think that also creates that ethical responsibility. We really need to look at the decisions, right? Since ethics is all about decisions, the decisions that we are making when it comes to game design, to how we design the communities around those games as well, right? We are living in a very complex scenario now where you might be playing a game, but you are socializing outside of the game. You're using another communication system. So you might be texting on their forum and then using voice chat on another platform. So what does that look like, really? It's a shared responsibility as well when it comes to the ethics aspect. because we can't do this alone, right? A game can't do this alone. They have Twitter accounts, they have Facebook where the community probably is, or Reddit or Discord. So there is a need to really look at ethics from a more holistic point of view as well. And those are the things that are driving my thought nowadays.
Carlos. Kate?
Yes, so this issue, I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. Well, I mean, overlapping, let's put it that way. But I think one of the biggest concerns I have on the player perspective side is ultimately it comes down to an issue of, do we respect the people who play our content or not? Do we really respect them? And at all kinds of levels. And I mean, in the culturalization work that I've been doing for so long, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, I remember my days when I started this work back at Microsoft, way back when, in the early 90s. And I remember telling people, well, we should be respecting the customers. That's why we're doing this. Nobody at the time really cared about respect. It's like, well, how is this going to save us money? And so I basically had to pivot my ability to argue the point towards a financial argument, which I did, which eventually I helped convince them that what we're really doing is maximizing the global reach of our content by ensuring that it's respectful of the local cultures into which we're selling it. And by using that kind of argument, they're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I get that. But it's unfortunate on one level. It's unfortunate that just saying respecting our customers and respecting our players, that should have been enough in my view, but it wasn't. I even remember at one point when I was running the geopolitical team I created at Microsoft, at one point I had a conversation with Bill Gates about who is the moral compass of the company. Who is making these high-level decisions for the company about how we're going to represent certain cultures, or whether or not we're going to represent the world in a certain way, whether it's a map, whether it's in a game or something else. And basically he deflected the question and said, we're a business. We're not really here to set morality, but I'm like, but we implicitly convey morality through our content by having narratives that reflect certain kinds of points of view, whether, for all kinds of reasons. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to see more companies do, and we're seeing a better trend over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, more and more companies, if they're going to represent a certain player's culture in the game, for example, they will get people from that culture and consult with them on how to appropriately, represent their culture in the game. We've seen multiple examples of that across different companies, especially in the last few years, because they realize that's the way it has to be done. We've seen a lot of societal upheaval over the last couple of years, and part of that is due to the fact that the powers that be, whatever those might be, whether it's a game development company or a studio or a publisher or whatever, they're not listening. They're not hearing the underrepresented voices, and they should be. And especially when we know for a fact, to kind of tie it back to the financial angle, we know that most of the growth in games these days is happening in non-traditional markets. So we're seeing growth in North America and Western Europe, but it's not nearly as big as we're seeing in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, Latin America, and so on. And so I think I feel similarly to what Carlos said. I think there is a moral imperative to, when we are designing games, to really keep the player in mind in a way that I think we have not done well at up to this point. And like I said, I've seen signs of it getting better, but I know we can do far better than we have been. And I'm hoping some of the current events that we've been going through are helping companies understand how important that really is.
Thank you, Kate. Kat?
So I feel like it feels strange being like, I care about ethics, because I feel like a lot of people do. In like the social media space, people will say, or, for the platforms will say, yeah, we think people should have human rights. And we want our platforms to not violate human rights. But the question is really like, how do we know that we're not violating human rights? How does actually preserving it happen on our platform? And like, what does that mean in practice? And so like, it's hard to be ethical, like even if you have that intent. So it's like, what is the due diligence of being ethical? I think is part of that package of ethics. So like what that means for me these days. So I'm really obsessed with like organizational ethnography and workflows, which sounds very boring, but it's kind of like, well, okay, when we're in the company, how do we think about these issues? And so something that has really emerged for me is seeing how KPIs, key performance indicators or metrics, really affect how we think about design, because we all face this pressure of meeting like engagement metrics, and engagement metrics are actually much easier to measure than things like safety, well-being, or trust. And things that you don't measure are much harder to prioritize because you can't really see that kind of cause and effect. It's not as real. And so you find these pressures within companies often to create more forms of engagement. Despite every time you add a form of engagement, you add a vector for harassment, a vector for addiction, antisocial behavior, and things like that. And so on top of that, even like not thinking about how we're reflecting our ethical values and like, how we measure and how we think about our platforms, people will say, oh, reports, if more reports are coming in, that probably means there's more harassment. If there's less reports coming in, there's less harassment. But research repeatedly actually surfaces the idea or the fact that people don't report as often if they fear retaliation, if they don't trust the platform to do anything, and if they've given up. And they might kind of slowly fade out of the game or accept it. And so it turns out the metric that people were following to try to be accountable to their players is actually telling them the opposite. And so it's actually very hard to distinguish these experiences. So that's why I keep going to this like due diligence. And I guess I don't really have the answers for that yet, but we'll figure it out in this panel. But yeah, so
you're very ambitious.
So yeah, I think on top of that, a lot of the ways we think about ethics is very reactive, right? And so what I like that we're doing here is thinking like sort of proactive, like what are the principles for starting about encouraging pro-social interaction, healthy engagement with games, and minimizing unwanted behavior. And so I think the example I think about often is Blizzard. For Overwatch, they had the commendation system, which as a product, that as a feature of the game, it actually was reactive. But what was nice is it commended people for being, good sports, I guess, like, good teammates, and kind of incentivized people to want to be good to each other and help each other out. Whereas a lot of people just think about, well, have a reporting system so you can harass people for being toxic. But that doesn't really necessarily stop people from being toxic in the first place, because there's also research about consequences not really affecting people's behavior. So I think for people to act on that, we kind of have to have best practices in the industry, right? And so that's why I'm going to also plug Fair Play Alliance. And actually, I just joined as an advisor, so I'm biased. But I think, collectively, having people who've been in the trenches for many years, who kind of get the issues past the metrics that we see, who've like kind of been there, seen the players, talked to them, and seen the history of how things have gone wrong. So us thinking about making the standards, disseminating them, connecting them to our values, I think is really key here. Because one thing that I think is really important is the design of like good experiences or like social experiences or making design ethical, like is game design. It's not on top of game design, it is part of game design. And I think that's really important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I see a lot of comments around streamers and YouTubers. I mean, that this initiative is not just about game developers. It's about the whole ecosystem. But I think it should start from game developers and to set, at least if I don't know if we're going to find the answers to all these questions yet, but at least if we could start asking the correct questions, the questions that can bring us to a sort of consensus, and the line is gonna move. This is how morality works. But at least if we can start somewhere and try to make it evolve, that would be great. So I'm looking at the time, it's already halfway through. So the second part was also to think about ethics, but from the game workers, the game industry workers point of view, because games, it's an art form and it's made by people. And human rights that we were talking about is also applying to these people. And it's also important to think about how we can raise the bar in terms of inclusion and diversity. We know how not diverse the game industry is so far, so we can see that in the games, but we also see it in the companies that don't have a diverse workforce. And even when they do have more diversity, are these people included? We were talking, there was a panel right before about inclusivity, and it's important for people to be included in the conversation so they can drive the effort of the company. And so my angle for that, I'm not a specialist of D&I, diversity and inclusion, but what I find interesting is the implicit biases. So again, coming from a kind of psychology, how these biases are influencing us, even if we believe we want to be inclusive and want to be diverse, we're gonna have that influence of these implicit biases. They're gonna make us do things that are non-inclusive. For example, we have the in-group bias. So I use that example often. I'm a woman, I'm white, I love video games. And so I'm gonna implicitly favor people that look like me, even though I don't really want to do that. But it's a bias that I have. And we need to be conscious of these biases. It's not gonna help us block them because they are implicit, but at least if we're conscious that these biases exist, we can change the environment at the company. We can change the hiring processes, the career development processes, so we don't fall for these biases, so we don't always hire the same people and promote the same people. So that's my angle very quickly. So Carlos?
My angle when it comes to the staff and to the people working in game companies is really protecting them from harassment and hate speech, and in two different avenues, right? It's a very trust and safety angle, the one that I'm going to offer here. But one is because the moderators, the staff who are responsible, or community managers who are reviewing that content, they are exposed to some pretty dreadful things, and there's an emotional toll there that is going to accumulate if they're not following some good practices and leveraging technology and other things, right? So I think there's an ethical consideration there for game companies to really think about the well-being of their staff as impacted by negative disruptive behaviors that are being, for a lack of a better word, facilitated in their platform. It's happening in their platform, right? Even though it's not the intention. And when it comes to the second angle, it's really to consider that the point of view also of game developers who are harassed themselves. And we're seeing this all the time, right? We're seeing this on Twitter. We're seeing this on many other places. So I think that's an ethical consideration as well. How do we change that landscape too? Like, game developers are often on the receiving end of that harassment themselves, not only their players. So I think that is something that's very much on my mind, and us being able to help, like Kat said, like some good practices in relation to this. How do we help game developers have a protocol to deal with this type of hate, be able to respond to this and feel safe? That is a huge question for sure.
Kate?
Yeah, so I'm coming at this perspective, especially on the worker side and on the industry side, a little more adamantly. I've been very vocal, I think, over the last few years, especially when I was part of the IGDA and even since then, about a lot of the what I would call injustices that happen to workers like every single day. We're seeing what's happening at Ubisoft right now in the level of upheaval that company's going through on the basis of multiple injustices they've been tolerating for years at that company. And I'm not calling them out, just specifically. There's many companies that fit that same model. And, I believe, and maybe I'm too much of a moralist, but I do believe some things are always right and some things are always wrong. And I think, racism or sexism is always wrong. I don't care the context. I don't care where it is. I think it's always wrong. And when you see a gender wage gap in your company, that's wrong. And it's always wrong. There's no moral justification or ethical justification for that. When you have your workers, work crunch and force them to work, 14, 16-hour days just because you're a poor project manager, that's wrong. And those things will always be wrong to me. And so one of the things that I would really like to see companies in this industry just unequivocally look at themselves in the mirror and say, is this the company we want to be? You know, I really truly believe that some of the leadership at Ubisoft, just to use them as a timely example, if they had had the opportunity to do that and really look at themselves in the mirror, even, 3 or 5 years ago, or you come back from this future and tell them this is what's going to happen if you don't get your shit together. I think they probably would have listened, but then again, you never know. Sometimes, people and companies have to go through the worst kind of crucible in order to come out the other side being improved. And you're hoping that they'll learn a lesson from it. And so my hope on the industry side is that there are so many things that that they need to be mindful of. And that's the word that I've used a lot when I've given lectures or when I've consulted with companies, like around my culturalization work. It's about mindfulness, making decisions with all implications in mind. A fully understanding, eyes wide open, that we're doing this because of this reason or that reason, not just doing it because that's the way it's always been done, or doing it because it's the whim of one particular CEO or a creative director or something else. And so I really am hoping, not only through this discussion, but the broader effort around ethics in the industry, it's to really bring mindfulness about our decision making and about our actions to the forefront, because they're under scrutiny. As we already said, players see it, the public sees it. We're still facing, as an industry and as an art form, a lot of public scrutiny still. Out there in the world. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that we keep screwing up because we're not very mindful and open and transparent about the kind of decisions we're making.
Yeah, to be fair, it's true in tech overall.
Yeah, it's not just us.
Yeah, it's not just us. That's not a good reason to not start thinking about it. Kat?
Yeah, gosh, I feel like people have kind of covered a lot of the things that I care about. So I think one thing that occurs to me a lot lately is that, given this is a very passion-driven industry, a large subset of people are like working unearthly levels of hours and everything. And I think it's harder to, and they don't necessarily self-regulate in what's healthy. And I like that the kind of example of a manager going home on time as setting a really good example for the employees. And because when a manager stays late, an employee feels the pressure to stay late. So if you're surrounded by a bunch of people who are very passion driven, you're like, well, if I'm going to keep my job, if I'm going to be competitive in this industry, I have to, ignore my family. I have to stay long hours and be unhealthy. And so thinking about the fact that it isn't just, like a policy at a company, but it's in fact these like very sort of soft social pressures that are constantly present, I think is something that's important to think about. I think, let's see, I feel like I'm trying not to repeat what everybody else is saying, but yeah, because actually building on what Carlos was saying too, with the community managers and kind of like moderators who have to like look at all of these reports. Yeah, they have these kinds of like burnout, secondary trauma, I guess. And there's something called compassion fatigue, where if you see a bunch of tough stuff or like people being awful, then you start feeling really depressed and having a decreased sense of compassion sometimes. And there's actually a term that I really appreciate these days called moral injury. It happens to doctors where they see their patients who are suffering, but because of insurance or because of something, they cannot give their patients the help they need. And so I feel like this is a different kind of level of moral injury, but I think people who are doing the moderation work, who are doing trust and safety, player behavior, there's a lot of different terms for it, I think. They're constantly seeing this stuff and they're often kind of held up because there's not a lot they can do sometimes. So I think the thing I want to advocate for there is kind of, a lot of it is like kind of located in a single team, but what does it mean to integrate a lot of these ethical concerns? And for me right now, it's a lot of like social and harassment oriented things. How do you integrate that into, the designers building a tool as opposed to them sending it over to the trust and safety player behavior team to like ruin all the fun, right? And so if you're constantly feeling these pressures against your own values and what you're doing, And the other people that you're working with aren't necessarily given the tools to understand what you're dealing with, right? So what does it look like to integrate that process? I think thinking about that is super important. And not having that, I think, is causing things like moral injury for people who do that kind of work. So that kind of support is not just like protecting them in terms of giving them security, or like security in a literal sense, right? They can lock down their stuff, emotional support. Also seeing moderators feeling this pressure to work as many hours as possible, like maybe even mandated therapy sessions, right? Where they have to go so they don't feel that pressure. I think all of that kind of stuff is really important, but hard to kind of narrow down on, because a lot of these experiences are also hard to detect in companies, and a lot of these pressures feel somewhat invisible until people start talking about it in a lot of these situations, or give it a name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true. So yeah, there's a lot of things to cover. We're already running late. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a website where we started to put together a starting point, a draft of a code of ethics. And so initially, what I was thinking was, when I was thinking about we need a code of ethics, I was more thinking towards through the perspective of UX. What would be the things that what are the lines that we should not cross to stay ethical? It was more towards around the questions on attention economy, loot boxes, dark patterns. And then I thought, yeah, but it's if we do that, we also need to understand the global elements like around the ecosystem of games, and we also need to understand the pressure that game industry workers can have, and so we also need to think about the ethics of workers. So it became a thing like, oh no, now we need to cover it all, and it's quite difficult to take on, and I know some people have been thinking about that for quite some time. So what we wanted to offer here is just a draft, a starting point with these two angles. So from the perspective of the players, how we can do to offer better games, ethically speaking, but also from the perspective of workers. We don't necessarily want to cover everything, but we want to have like some high-level guidelines. And you'll see on the website there's two elements. You have like the guidelines themselves, like we try to stay pretty high level, and then if you click on learn more, we try to dive deeper to give more precise elements. So what we would like now, we are encouraging all of you to look at this draft and give your feedback. Participate if you're already working on your end on ethics, whatever the angle. Let me know. The idea is also to make it a hub to direct to people who've been working, like organizations that have been doing a great, lots of effort and doing great work on the different angles. And so this is what we're trying to accomplish, to have all of you participate so we can shape this code of ethics together. And hopefully, if we find a consensus, then I know that's a wild dream, but hopefully maybe we can get companies and platforms to pledge for this code. So I don't know if Kat, maybe Kat, you can start because you've always been speaking last, so it's not fair. So if you want to explain a little bit what we're trying to do here, and then Carlos and Kate, I don't know how you want to do that.
Yeah, I guess I see it as distilling a lot of these conversations all over the place, because I think you hear bits and pieces everywhere. And so it's hard to communicate and give that context to people who have not been part of that conversation. So I really like this as bringing kind of a common context or understanding of how we're talking about these issues. And even just the beginning of kind of negotiating, what are our values? What do we mean by these values, and kind of gives us like a starting place to, and even for some of these points in the document or on the website, a lot of them are already kind of actionable, but I think it's a starting place for seeing how to make a lot of these things actionable. Because yeah, when you have like diversity and inclusion, you want to have diversity and inclusion at your company, but like, yeah, like what does that mean? Is this HR policies? Is HR the right place to do it? And I think that it's also for establishing very clear basic standards, right? To hold companies accountable or to hold people accountable. But finally, for me, I think it's also for it to be core in game development education, right? I think we can really, even like in a sense, this almost creates a syllabus, right? For how to like start thinking about the ethics in games. And I don't think it necessarily has to be like one class. I do think this is something that should be integrated into, game development classes. And so I think all of these sort of different pieces are kind of connected, but I think this is a really important place for that.
Carlos and Kate, do you want to add on that? And while Carlos and Kate are talking, feel free to ask your questions now, and we're going to try to answer some of them as fast as we can.
Yeah, I mean, I just add a few more comments. I mean, Kat covered it really well, but just to add an additional perspective, I mean, to me, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, which is really bringing to the forefront what I would consider to be the substrate beneath so many conversations we've been having in the industry, because a lot of these issues that we've been dealing with, whether it's inclusion or sexism or whatever else it might be, they all tie back to some kind of ethical foundation that is either broken or lacking, or it's there, but it's just not as transparent as it should be. And so I'm kind of having a little bit of deja vu right now, because back in my years at Microsoft, this was, I think, in the late 90s, is when I was asked to be part of a small team that wrote the code of ethics for Microsoft. And it was after the company had been in existence for over 20 years. And when they first approached me and said, hey, we want your help on this, I'm like, wait a minute, we don't have a code of ethics for a company of this size that's been around for this long. And so in a certain way, I kind of feel that about this effort, in a way, is kind of like that for the industry. The industry's been around for quite a few decades now, and it would not hurt to have a focal point, to have discussions around this topic, especially if we aspire to be a more mature industry, and to basically live up to the status we have as the largest consumed form of entertainment on Earth. So I think we have a responsibility to do that, and this is a great way to get that started.
Carlos?
What I love about the initiative is that it's very action-based, right? And I've definitely heard that from Kat, from Kate. It's just this idea that, well, think about ethics. It's perhaps the most practical branch of philosophy. And we're walking the walk here. We actually have, you can go to the website, and if your interest is on the loot box topic, you can go and find good information about that, references and studies. It's the same idea for the other area as well, right? Hopefully you can find some helpful things when it comes to designing the community, designing the game, like Kat said, to maximize pro-social behavior, right? So that's what I love about it. And I think the fact that it's also a collaboration will make this even better, right? Like, let's also walk that walk and include a very diverse group of people, and then we're going to be able to hopefully have something that's practical and, as somebody said in the chat there, hit critical mass, right? Yep. So people can start using it and scrutinizing it and what can be improved, and we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be diverse. So please, if you're interested, hop on, and on the website you have there's a feedback button. So you click on feedback, you get a form, so you can just like give some of your feedback, but you can also participate further if you give us your info, so we can get back to you. So there was a question regarding, I see one question. Well, no, there's more questions. Okay, I don't think we're gonna have the time to answer them all. But there's a question relating to Animal Crossing. So in Animal Crossing, at some point you run out of all your tasks, which is arguably a good thing to do in games. Too, at some point there's nothing more to do, so it's a good element for people to have a break. Another game that does that really elegantly is World of Warcraft. If you leave the game and you rest, and when you come back, you have double XP for a certain amount of time, which is a way to reward your disengagement with the game, or at least you're not penalized for disengaging with the game. And so these are the elements that we need to discuss. It's not clear, and that's the reason why we need to talk about that, because it's not rather about this is creating addiction. Addiction is something different. Like I said, it's a whole different story. But how do we manage engagement? We are encouraging engagement in many of our games, and sometimes we are punishing disengagement. And so that's where maybe we can put the ethical line. It's to discuss. And so that's the things that we need to define, but that's more in the actionable part of the initiative. Maybe the code would be, we need to pay attention to not punish disengagement, and then we can try to dive deeper and try to figure out exactly what that means, because it's not easy. If you folks want to add anything on that,
I don't know, you said it very well.
Yeah. Well done.
There's a question from Becky that I would like to address, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
And just to read the question here, there's a broad consensus about how much better is it to build proactive measure against harassment into game design from the start, right? But then she's saying after the game has been released, it's a reactive approach. And she's saying, but how do you do that kind of beyond the punishment consequences that aren't very effective, right? And especially when the norms are already established in the community. So my thoughts around that is that a lot of times we look at chat moderation as just the ban hammer, just that one tool. And I see that as only one piece of a holistic player behavior strategy, right? So one thing that companies could do, for example, is to start classifying and understanding troublesome chat and warn players. Educate them timely with timely warning messages, right? It doesn't have to be all about suspensions and bans. You might experiment with muting somebody for an X amount of time. You know, they can still play the game, but their social interaction benefits have been revoked, and privileges. And same thing you can do, of course, with the warning messages, right? And there are creative ways to engage with that, and perhaps also reward users for the positive behavior that they are displaying and for being ambassadors, right? Companies can also do that based on the chat that's rolling through. So I think we need to move away from just thinking about the consequences and the punishment and think about the other elements of those social interactions.
Yeah, I think, well, you covered most of it. But one thing that I think people think of it as reactive is probably like reporting forms, like I said before. And I think for reporting forms, I think is an issue of empowering players to feel like they can report, right? So focusing on making people feel like, yes, the platform will act, yes, something will happen, and yes, they can still feel safe is important. And part of that is also articulating what harmful behavior is. Because if you have harassment, because one of my pet peeves with Facebook is that harassment and hate speech are two mutually exclusive categories, and you don't know which one to choose sometimes. So allowing people to express through reporting forms or other forms of escalation, what's happening to them, where they feel like it's representative of what's happening to them, and they feel like the company is acknowledging it. For a lot of people who are dealing with these issues online, sometimes when I'd walk with them through it, if they're like dealing with harassment, they would tell me, I thought I was going crazy. So you telling me that actually this is bad is actually making me realize and feel empowered to fight back, right? Or to maybe not fight back, but, to push back or, be more self-righteous even. And I think that's really difficult with things like the chilling effect, where people don't really participate as much. So that's why I think it's very important to think about what are those kinds of tools of empowerment. And I think on some level, I do want to push back on the broad consensus about how it's better to build proactive measures. I think on some level I think that is agreed upon on the surface, but when it actually comes to sort of enactment of those kinds of principles, I think people actually don't invest that much time into it.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just popping in everywhere at the same time, so I lost track. So there's a question for Kate that I just saw.
Oh, yeah.
We're considering how to be respectful of local expectations, and it's moving as I read it. Does the statement have in mind who constitutes local?
Yes. No, that's a great question. Yeah, I saw that out of the corner of my eye. So yeah, thank you, Timothy, for that. Yeah, oftentimes how we group and how we decide to include or exclude groups is really, really important. And it's oftentimes in not just in games, but in any industry, but especially in tech, we tend to do that so implicitly. It's like, well, they all speak Spanish, or they all speak Japanese. Well, sometimes the culture and the language are pretty coincidental with each other, like Japanese and Korean are really good examples of that. But Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, I mean, a lot of these, they're not homogeneous cultures that coincide with the language. And so we have to be really careful about what we assume to be local. I mean, because oftentimes we're operating from a business perspective, usually we're operating country by country, not language by language. And so because usually the country, that is the entity into which we are selling goods. They are the ones that we are going to pay tariffs on or not, and taxes and all that other stuff. And your point about repressive regimes, that is one of the considerations we have to deal with when doing business. I mean, we've seen how many companies, not just in the game industry, but in especially creative media today. I mean, you look at many examples in film where they bend over backwards to satisfy the Chinese government's expectations at the exclusion of expectations from other cultures, such as, showing maps that show the South China Sea as Chinese territory, even as just a passing image in the background. That is a really politically charged thing to do, and yet a lot of these companies are doing things like that because they want their product to be sold in China, because whether we like it or not, it is the largest gaming market now. It is going to become very swiftly, I believe, this year, maybe not as much because of COVID, but it was on its way to become the largest film consumption market as well. And so we have to consider this really goes back to that crux of the ethical issues when we have to decide, are we going to change our content to satisfy a repressive regime, or are we going to stand our ground, draw a line in the sand, and say, we're going to stick to our creative vision, we are not going to change it. And if we don't sell in China, we don't sell in China. That's just the way it is. And not many companies are willing to take that stand because there's too much money at stake. So my hope is that we're going to see a lot more companies, and that's one of the things I try and walk them through that decision-making process is, are you going to be the company that makes a decision based on your own values, or are you going to align your values with those of a regime that might be problematic?
Yep. Thank you, Kate. So I see that we are 2 minutes until to the end, so we're gonna wrap it up now. I'm sorry we could not answer all the questions, but it's an ongoing effort, and we want it to be collaborative. So again, if you want to participate, if you know of orgs that already have been doing some work, please let us know. We really want it to be collaborative, to have as many people as possible joining, and again, from all the video game ecosystem, not just the studios. And so we hope that we can build that together, maybe reach a consensus, and then we can see if the leaders and the actors of the game industry would agree to follow this code. We also, on my end, I'm also gonna try to dive deeper on the game design side of it, the content, what it means to be ethical. So I'm gonna have another element that's gonna be another website that's gonna be a game design, ethicalgamedesign.com. And so if you want to participate in that, if you're more into the UX design side of it, so we can define together what are dark patterns in the video game industry and what we need to do, please reach out to me so we can do that. We're gonna do a follow-up at GDC Summer this summer. So we're gonna say, what happened, what was the reception, and what's gonna be the next steps. I think we're running out of time. If Carlos, Kate, and Kat, you just want to have a very quick conclusion to this panel, and what are your hopes and dreams for the future?
I guess one thing I have to say is it's really hard to keep up momentum around stuff like this, especially because it's not like, contributing necessarily directly to financial gain and things like that. So yeah, like it's so important we keep up the momentum, that we keep talking about this actively.
Yep.
Yeah, I echo the same thing. I mean, we've seen a lot of initiatives in this industry come and go. So we're hoping that this is something that's going to stick. I hope that the confluence of recent cultural and societal events and history in our industry and beyond is what will help this stick and help it become an ongoing conversation.
And for me, it's let's put into practice. Ethics is nothing if there's no action. So let's do it.
Yes.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Carlos, Kate, and Kat. And thank you for the many people who participated already in the draft. And for all of you who are going to participate now, I'm also going to reach out to a lot of other folks very soon. So please join the conversation and stay tuned.